find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on a
Welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, what's today's exciting topic?
Anatomy of Desire, an interview with Mihaly Jamea.
Yes, and she was great.
Yes, she was. We packed in a lot in that short interview, but
We did.
Boy, she has some fabulous ideas.
She does, and and a great book. Mm-hmm. And check it out. it's really good stuff. Speaking of great books, let's tout ours for a little bit.
Okay, well, why don't we tout The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible, since it's on the top of the heap, by Laria Zilber.
You said it's on the top of the heap. I thought you were going to say it's on the topic.
Oh,
because it is.
Well, it is on the topic.
It is on the
because,
topic.
She's a relationship and sex therapist.
Absolutely.
And, if you want to have, a little spice up your sex life, reading erotica to each other is a really good way to do it. And this book, in my humble opinion, has some really nice erotica.
It has beautiful erotica. I will also note, you'll see when you see the interview with Mihaly, that there are 5 secrets that she talks about, and curiosity being one of them. And if curiosity piques your interest, they should get your book.
Absolutely.
Really good. To say nothing of also like all the other ones, sensuality, and you'll see in the interview.
That's right. It's got it all.
And what else we got here?
We got Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. That's one of Bruce's books.
That's one of my books.
But he's got a few of them.
I have several.
And it's not about communication, why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong.
Yep, that was my second one, and the one that started the podcast, as you always like to say.
That's the one, Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back. And
Absolutely.
we talked about that. We talked about intimacy and stability and
we did.
all those fun, good things that you lay out so well in your book.
So when you get a hold of Emily's book, don't forget to get a hold of like all of mine and yours too.
Exactly.
Buy books, folks. That's a good thing to do. Anyway, we will go on with our interview, and we'll see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Dr. Mihaly Jamea. Dr. Jamea is a sex and relationship therapist. In addition to her practice helping people with sexual and relationship hurdles, she is a speaker and best-selling author. Her work has been featured in Oprah Magazine, USA Today, and many other well-known publications and media outlets, and she hosts the podcast called Love and Libido. Her recent book is Anatomy of Desire, 5 Secrets to Create Connection and Cultivate Passion. Mihaly, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Thank you so much for allowing me to join you two today.
Well, we're delighted to have you. So we always like to start off by asking our guests, how'd you get into the work you do? Tell us something about your own journey.
Oh, sure. So it turns out I was giving sex advice long before I was qualified to do so. I grew up in a very small conservative town in Southeast Tennessee, and my dad was an OBGYN. So in my house, sex was not taboo. I heard just about everything through his conversations with patients on the phone for the most part, plus the information that they gave to me. But as I entered into adolescence, it quickly became apparent that the level of kind of confidence and empowerment that I felt discussing sexual issues or even going to my parents with questions was not a feeling shared by many of my peers. Mm-hmm. And so they would come to me and, kind of ask me like, is this normal? Or what do you think of this? Or could you ask your dad? Would that be weird? And it wasn't weird for me. And, so I think that's why I say from an early age, I was probably helping people in that department a bit more than I was qualified to do.
Yeah, I just want to put it at this moment. I'll bet you're thinking the same thing. So when I read your book, I was noting we immediately thought of the series Sex Education. Do you know that series? It was a British series.
I know that series. I still haven't watched it, even though everyone tells me I need to watch it.
It's about you.
Sounds like you.
So I hear.
This high school kid his mother is a sex therapist, and he ends up becoming the go-to guy on his high school campus about sex questions.
I know, as my poor kids will probably be as well. Yep.
So fast forward.
Yeah, so fast forward, we ended up moving to Texas. I was at the University of Texas studying psychology and took a human sexuality elective and was just hooked. I think it was at that point that I discovered that you can get a really unique perspective into someone's psyche by asking them questions about how they understand, experience, and express their sexuality. And by the time I graduated, I think I had taken every human sex ed course the university offered, and really focused all of my research and training in that department. And then I moved back to Houston, and hung up my shingle. And at that time, there I was one of like three certified sex therapists in a city of 4
Wow.
million people.
Mm.
So there was
Wow.
a need, and it has just been the most rewarding journey and calling, and I feel so fortunate to have this opportunity to help people there.
Mm, yeah. I'm reminded as you're describing that sense that asking about a couple's sex life or their attitudes about it is a really good window. I'm remembering David Schnarch. You know that
Yes.
name, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, yeah.
For our listeners, he was a psychologist who died several years ago.
Yeah, not too long ago.
Yeah, he was only in his early 70s, and as a guy in my early 70s, I'm thinking that's too young. But anyway, he wrote his first big book was The Sexual Crucible, and I think
Yes,
that was pretty much his thesis, which was he didn't call himself a sex therapist. He was a couples therapist.
right.
He would use sex as the crucible in which lots of things could be worked out.
So
And
true. So
yeah.
true. Yeah, absolutely. That's how I see it as well. And yes, Schnarch's work has been for sure a source of inspiration to my own. I think I quote him at some point in my book.
Yeah.
Another thing that you talk about is flow, and I can't get his name right. You're going to have to say it.
Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. It
There
took me
you
it
did
took me
it. That's
ages to learn how to say that years ago, but now I can say it. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so can you talk about that and how that relates to a couple's intimate life?
Sure. So, I had been doing this work for a long time, and, had reached a point in my career where I could help women reach orgasms. I could help, them overcome painful intercourse. I could help men, manage ED, and I could help a couple improve desire and satisfaction. But I would occasionally get people returning, usually for their accountability session, longing for more intensity and passion. It's like they didn't want to necessarily settle. Yeah, I adore Barry McCarthy, but he came up with the quote, good enough sex model. And they just didn't want to settle for that kind of good enough sex. And so I started paying closer attention to the language that they were using to describe the sex they wanted. Words like, I want the world around me to disappear. I want it to feel effortless. I want it to feel like it seems like it does in Hollywood. And initially, I was kind of quick to remind them that Hollywood is Hollywood, not realistic, that the honeymoon stage is not sustainable. But as I started paying closer attention to the language they were using to describe the sex they wanted, I kind of had a light bulb moment. And I was like, oh, they're describing a flow state. And I was like, well, that makes sense. Of course, it's what we would want to experience when we make love. And so I was familiar with flow state. So for your listeners who haven't heard of it, it's a decades old term, as you mentioned, coined by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, an American Hungarian psychologist and one of the fathers of positive psychology. And he observed that when people are engaged in an activity in which they experience, complete and total absorption, rapt attention and focus, they experience things like a sense of effortlessness, or time seems to speed up or slow down. Think of, a surfer who's at one with the wave, that it's almost like a transcendent state, if you will. So I was familiar with flow. It's not something, though, that I had ever really heard about or read in conjunction to sex. So I turned to the literature, the academic literature, to see what I could find, and there was nothing out there. I found, one study that looked at a very small sample of BDSM practitioners, looking at it specifically a couple of components of flow, but it didn't really answer the research question I had, which was, you know, is what people experience when they have sex at that more optimal level, who score high on sexual satisfaction, are they in fact experiencing a flow state? So I initiated my own study, and found out that yes, people were experiencing flow. And not only that, that flow ended up being a predictor of great sex, which was really exciting to me as a practitioner because I was like, wow, by teaching people about flow, I could kind of develop a new and exciting approach to helping boost desire and satisfaction. And what I did then was I called up my research participants who got the highest scores on the assessments and had really long conversations with them about how they experienced flow, what that was like for them, and what kinds of things they did to get there. And it was through those conversations, for the most part, that these five secrets emerged, which set the foundation for the book.
And great
And
segue. Yes.
right, and the five secrets are.
Tell us about the five secrets. Yeah.
Yeah. So the five secrets are sensuality, curiosity, adaptability, vulnerability, and attunement. Those are the five secrets. And I'll say, just quickly, one thing that as I sat back and was kind of poring over the data and looked at these five components, it occurred to me that we're all born with these things.
Mhm.
We are born sensual. I mean, babies understand and experience the world through the five senses. We are born curious. I have a 4.5-year-old kid, and I think he meets the statistic of like 4-year-olds ask an average of, I think, 400 questions a day. For sure. That's a fact.
We're going to be seeing our 4-year-old grandson. We have 6 grandchildren. We're going to be seeing him among others.
And the 3-year-old.
And yes,
Yeah.
and yeah, we
Yeah,
have
you need
3-year-old, yes.
You need like a ticker for every
Yeah.
question.
We'll have to
Question,
count.
question.
No, I
Yeah.
think that would apply to him though.
Yes, it
4-year-old.
would.
Yes.
So, and then, we can adapt to just about every situation, as frustrating as it may be. Sometimes we can do it. We are born vulnerable and with the ability to attune to others in the world around us. So, these secrets, it's not about becoming someone you're not. I think when
Yeah.
people start thinking about their sex life, it feels like a really far stretch. The way I write about these things is more about reconnecting with qualities that already exist within us, but that for various reasons we've lost touch with over time.
Yeah. You're implying there, and I'm trying to remember if you may even address this in the book, the notion of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset is certainly implicit in what you were just saying, right? It's like,
Oh, yes.
turns out you can learn this stuff.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
it's not like because I'll work with so many couples, and you perhaps see this too, where, I mean, if I stereotype a bit, where one of them is an engineer, almost always the guy.
Oh, yeah. I know those couples.
Yeah.
I'm in
And
Houston. We have a lot of engineers in the oil and gas
absolutely,
sector.
yes. And it's like, they both of them will be saying, well, that's just not who he is.
Yep.
And come to discover, no, actually, maybe you can learn some stuff, especially if you have the idea that it's possible. And that's kind of what you're saying. It's like, well, it is possible.
Absolutely. And I do write about growth mindset versus fixed mindset in the book, because I do think so much of this is about adopting the right kind of mindset in order to grow as an individual and with your partner. Relationships are living, breathing organisms that evolve with time. But if you have a fixed mindset and develop or adopt kind of a set it and forget it mentality, then you're inevitably going to feel stuck at some
Yeah.
point. And then what do you do when, you've got a baby crying in the next room, or, an arthritic hip that means you can't rely on the position you used to depend on? People who have a growth mindset, or the words we use in sexuality research is sexual growth beliefs versus sexual destiny beliefs. So do you
Yes.
believe that your sexuality is kind of your destiny and that's it? Or can you grow and evolve? And the people I spoke to, and a lot of them had been together for decades and had plenty to say about the adaptations that they had to make in
Mhm.
order to maintain a strong connection.
That, I'm reminded, it's funny, I never met David Schnarch, but I was greatly, you can hear in what I'm saying, I'm greatly influenced by his work, 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And one of the things I always like to quote of his is he would give lectures and would ask people, at what age do you think people reach their sexual peak? And of course, the stereotypical answer would be, well, men at 18 and women at 30 or whatever, and he would say, nope, both men and women in their 60s and 70s.
Oh,
And of
yeah.
course, what he's talking about, even for the to be able to tolerate the anxiety of desire at a high
Yeah.
level,
Yes.
requires maturity, and that's what
Oh,
you're describing, that adaptability is all about maturity.
absolutely. A lot of my work was inspired by Dr. Peggy Kleinplatz's work, who was one of the first to really study sex at the optimal level. So much of what is out there in the literature is research on sexual dysfunction and then sexual satisfaction. And she was, kind of like, okay, what's happening like the upper echelon of peak pleasure for people? And in the first study she did, she didn't even bother interviewing people who were under the age of 65.
Wow.
Huh.
Ah,
I
good
know,
here.
I know. It's like, yes.
We qualify.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I loved that because, she has been doing this work forever and knew that 20 somethings, wouldn't really have anything to add. And in
Uh-huh.
fact, a lot of the people I spoke with in my interviews, I mean, not one of them said the best sex they had was in the honeymoon stage. Not
Hmm.
one of them said the best sex they had was when they were 23 years old and at peak fertility or whatever.
Hmm.
Human desire is a lot more complex than we give
Hmm.
it credit for. And it's something that I really believe can be cultivated and maintained with a bit of effort and intention.
So speaking of effort and intention, you also there's actually the one I wrote down, your idea of goal-oriented sex, which is pretty much heretical, right? So I
Right.
love that.
Total
And
heretic.
a related, I think slightly different, but related concept is planned sex. That comes
Mhm.
up in my conversations with folks a lot, where,
Yeah,
yeah, and I read about that in your book too. It's like people say, no, no, it's not authentic if it's
Yeah,
not
right. It has to be
spontaneous. It has to be
spontaneous.
spontaneous.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's of course all the issues like it ain't going to happen for a lot of folks if you don't plan at least the possibility.
exactly,
But I
exactly.
really love that wrinkle you added, which is no, you can actually have goals in mind. You can actually be thinking, not just orgasm, of course, but
Sure.
you can actually be thinking, well, this is what I want to work on developing. What do you think?
Yeah.
So please tell us about that.
Yeah, so 99.9 of sex therapists will tell you never to have goal-oriented
Hmm.
sex. As you said, it's
Yeah.
like so heretical to say anything different. And they're well-meaning. The
Yes.
idea is that if
Yes.
you're working towards a goal, you're going to kind of miss out on the moment by moment pleasures and interaction. However, one of the best predictors of flow is shared goals.
Mm.
And so I reframe it a little bit because I think if everyone is on the same page about what they're wanting from the sexual experience, they are far more likely to experience high levels of satisfaction from it. We can actually learn a lot from the BDSM community, and it's not surprising to me that that was the sample that was used in the one study I found. And there's a lot of goals and planning that goes into creating those scenes that are then
Mm.
enacted. And so I think even on a smaller scale, if you want to see if, hey, maybe this time, let me see if I could have multiple orgasms. I've never really been intentional about that. Or let's use this sex together, tomorrow night to kind of we both want it to be really romantic and tender. Like, yeah, let's make that our goal. What do we need to put in place to feel that? Do we need to light some candles? Do we need freshly laundered sheets? Like, what's going to set the scene for us? Or do we want to be kind of naughty or do we need to enact like a power play dynamic? Like, what are we both wanting from the
Mhm.
sexual experience? I think that, just having a little conversation sometimes can be enough to then put your focus there.
Yeah.
And, we have plenty of research on group flow. Flow is not something that just happens individually. A group of musicians come together with the shared goal of, creating harmony. A group of athletes come together with the
I will
shared
note
goal of winning the game.
I do a lot of music, and that is, I've often commented on that. The most intimate moments I've had in my life, other than, and not just sexually, but sexually, emotionally with my partner, have
Uh-huh.
been music. And
Uh-huh.
sometimes with pretty much strangers, but
Yes.
that's happened. But it's incredibly intimate when you get
Mm.
into that flow state.
But
Oh,
also
yeah.
talking, what you were saying about talking to your partner about these goals, I think just even the process of talking about it brings
Mm.
on a new level of intimacy that they might not have considered otherwise, because if they're so used to just going into the bedroom and
Yeah.
initiating, but bringing it out of the bedroom and into a conversation earlier in the day, and then you can build up anticipation and think about and get your imagination going. Well, what am I going to do when if we're having this role play, or if we're having this romantic dinner? What music am I going to put on? What's his favorite song? What's her favorite song? What do we like doing? Are we going to dance? So it gets a whole conversation going. I like that.
Precisely. The conversation is in and of itself intimacy building.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. 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 It is so interesting how often I'll be working with a couple. I was just thinking, I had a session yesterday where this came up, and they just don't talk about it. And,
Mhm.
you know, and then they're wondering, gee, why do they have such difficulty connecting? And there's this belief out there often, aside from all of the shame and the, you know, the being programmed for a long time that, oh, you're not
Sure.
supposed to, but there's this sense that it somehow kind of takes away from it if you actually go ahead and talk.
Right.
And it's amazing what comes out when people actually are willing to talk about it.
Totally. I mean, great sex is not this mysterious event that spontaneously happens magically. I
Yeah.
mean, we know that it's one of the biggest sex myths. And, back to what you brought up before about planning it. I mean, that is one of the biggest myths that persists around what makes great sex is the idea that great sex is always spontaneous. I have a whole list in the book of like all the holes that are in that theory and why, there's so much you can do to instead with the right mindset,
Yeah.
and with a reframe plan really fantastic.
Well, and I noted, if I'm remembering the section you're talking about, you did point out that we call it dating,
Oh,
but,
yeah.
and it isn't always about sex per se, but it
No.
certainly is. You know, the difference between a platonic date and a non-platonic date is the possibility of sex, right? That's the
Mhm.
only difference.
Right.
And people are often, when they know there's the possibility, they're planning all kinds of things like that.
Oh,
They're
yeah, they
calling it
shave
that.
the things, they wear the good underwear. I
Yeah.
mean, there's quality. Yeah, all the components are there. Everyone
Yeah.
may not state it explicitly, but everyone kind of knows what's probably going to go down at the end of the night.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So if couples had to pick just one of the secrets to better sex, which would it be and why?
Oh, gosh, it's a tough question to answer. I could say one, but what I want to say, and I will at the end of this, but what I want to say instead is, this book, what I hoped for it is that it's a book people can keep on their shelves, and pull for different seasons in life. What I tell people, if you are a family, for instance, with young kids and you're both working and life is busy and chaotic, and you need to kind of figure out how to slow down, then I would read the sensuality chapter. It's all about kind of how to Marie Kondo your sex life and how to quiet down the mind, which
If
is
it gives you
especially,
joy, keep it, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. But it's all about how to quiet the mind and re-inhabit the body, which I think for busy women is especially challenging. Um, if, however, sex has become kind of monotonous and predictable and boring, and you need to spice things up a little bit, then I would say look at the curiosity chapter. And this is not a chapter. I mean, it is about spicing things up, but in I think a bit of a deeper, more nuanced way. I really write about like the psychology of novelty, and I draw from flow state science. I talk about things like the challenge skills balance. And so people understand how to go about kind of expanding their comfort
That's
zones in a
4%, right?
4%.
4%. Yeah.
That's
And you
it.
know, I saw that, and I didn't bother trying to follow up on the research. It's like, where do they get a number like that? You know, I don't
Yeah.
know how you measure that, but anyway, but I get the idea. It's like 4% out of your ability range. That amount of challenge is just, it's kind of the sweet spot, right?
That's the
It's
sweet
like, okay,
spot.
because you can
Yeah.
feel it. Maybe it's possible, but it's exciting because you can't quite do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And I've been applying this work to my clients, and I wish this story would have made it into the book, but it was already in editing. But I was talking about this with a couple, and, they were just kind of stuck on like the same old boring missionary position. It had become boring for them. And I was talking about this 4% and kind of variations of what they could do. And he came back, and they were both really excited to tell me that like the last time it was still the missionary position, but he took her hands and kind of pinned them over her head in sort of a dominant way. Well, that got her attention in a really like, kind of profound, like, ooh, it sort of invited her to surrender to the process. Still missionary position.
Hmm.
He took something that was familiar, but found a way to make it more psychologically interesting,
Hmm.
so it's not much we're talking about
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, and so, okay, so moving on, then I would say, if you are a couple who is struggling to overcome, a life adjustment issue or hurdle in your relationship, then I would say pull out the book and look at the adaptability chapter because that's what that's all about. If
Mhm.
you feel
That's
like
about aging too, by the way.
it
Just got to
is,
say that is so
yeah,
about aging
yeah,
because that's what happens. I mean,
Well,
uh,
that's what Emily said earlier,
yeah,
arthritic hips and
exactly.
yeah, exactly,
You've been
exactly.
listening in on our conversations?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, my second pregnancy messed up my left hip, and I have had to make a few adaptations
Uh-huh.
because of the persistent issues I have there. But yes, and I love the adaptability chapter because it's really that chapter that's going to give you the tools you need to sustain a sexual connection that stands the test of time. If you feel like sex is kind of just something you're doing with your body or you're disconnected in your relationship and are therefore struggling to get sex back on track, then the vulnerability chapter is a good one to read. And then the attunement chapter, I tell people is in many ways the gestalt of the other four chapters. It's kind of where everything comes together to give you that kind of feeling of the experience is bigger than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
Sort of that two become one. The analogy I use in that chapter is like a pair of ballroom dancers who appear to glide across the floor as one unit. And, she knows when he shifts his weight in a certain way, what that's signaling her body to do. And it has that effortless feeling to it,
Mhm.
despite a lot of effort being put into it.
Sure.
And so that chapter is really about learning to tune in to one another's nonverbal cues, how to experience more synchrony with your partner. There's such an emphasis these days on, communication skills, and especially post Me Too movement on kind of ongoing enthusiastic consent. And that's all important. I
Mhm.
don't know about you. I would like to kind of keep my mouth shut for the majority of the experience,
It's
unless
it's
like,
really important, and it's also potentially deadly.
yeah,
Both.
yes,
Yeah, yeah.
I know, but this is about, learning each other's nonverbal cues, so that you can kind of let your bodies do the talking.
Mhm.
Yeah.
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 My one of my the aspects of my brand, I suppose, if I could claim a brand, I always talk to people about the two sets of needs we need in relationships, which are stability and intimacy, and how they're both needs, they're both important, but they're somewhat in conflict with each other. And it's interesting, mapping what you were talking about, your five secrets onto that. I'm thinking, wow, what I'm hearing it, this may not be what you intended, but what
Mhm.
I'm hearing is that's a way of unpacking what intimacy means because all of those are aspects of intimacy. And
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about attunement, or even the notion of enthusiastic consent. That's all about stability, which is important.
Yes.
Safety is about stability. That's
Yeah.
really important. And yet it can also just be death to intimacy if you let it be so.
Yes.
So that idea that you can play with that a little bit without
Mm-hmm.
freaking out. And that's the other thing I'm always saying.
Right.
This one. We once said if people did a drinking game during our podcast where every time I said the phrase tolerate the anxiety, they took would be
Yeah, they took a shot.
schnockered by the end of it. And that's, you might recognize that from Schnarch too. That was
I
my
do.
understanding.
I was
Yes.
gonna say, I mean, this is so Schnarch. It's the
Yeah.
ability to hold space for both.
Yeah.
And I
Mhm.
Yeah.
think even though it feels, when you think about, okay, intimacy and stability feels like it's contradictory to autonomy and independence and that sort of thing. But I really think they're dependent on each other.
Yeah.
You can't really have one without the other. And I think a lot of
Well, yeah.
people, they hear stability and they mistake it for enmeshment, but that's not
Yes.
what it is.
It's not. And the absence of intimacy itself becomes destabilizing. That's the
Exactly.
problem. I'd say a pretty substantial majority of the folks who come to see me, and I'm not a sex therapist per se, I'm a couples
Mm-hmm.
therapist, but the folks, a pretty substantial majority, are pretty good at stability. Their
Mm-hmm.
problem is intimacy.
Yes.
And so I'll be recommending your book, of course, to them because,
Well, thank you very much.
because it really does give you, I think, a really, a much richer view of that notion
Mm.
of intimacy.
Yeah.
So
Well, let me turn the
thank you.
question around to the two of you. I mean, I know you had a chance to go through the book a little bit. I know you said you didn't finish it
Mhm.
completely, but so far, what do you think has stood out the most in terms of being the most important component?
Wow. Well, I think from my standpoint, I just said it, it's that sense that you can actually look in a very rich, nuanced way at what intimacy means.
Yeah.
I have a chapter in one of my books called Sex, Great Sex, and Sex, Good
Good
Sex,
sex
and
and
Sacred
sacred
Sex.
sex. Yeah.
Oh, I
And
love that.
yeah, and you're talking, and the gradations there are plain old sex. The first one is just whatever you think it is. And
Mhm.
even that requires that you not be freaking out. It requires that not have processed sexual trauma and things like that. But then to get to good sex, that's what I call intimate,
Yep.
which is to say you're actually present. That relates a lot to your sense of, well, sensuality and actually pretty much all of them. And sacred sex is when you get up to that level of attunement where it's not just the two of you anymore. And
Yep.
flow, of course, fits into that really nicely.
That's where it is.
Anyway, that's
Yeah.
that's kind of what I took. I don't know what your
Yeah.
sense
Well,
was.
I'm not a therapist, so
Okay.
I don't
She's a
deal
real
with all
person.
the, I think what probably stood out for me was the adaptability because you go
Yeah.
through so many different phases in your life. And,
Mhm.
whether it's, if you're having your period or if it's menopause, whatever it is, and aches and pains, is that ability to be adaptable and have your partner also be adaptable. So,
Exactly. Yeah. And I think I mean, I love hearing, from people who aren't therapists, what stood out the most for them, because that tells me
mhm.
kind of what feels the most practical. But, coming back to this discussion of, security, stability, and intimacy and kind of freedom and autonomy, the throughout each chapter, I talk about a different flow component. There's 8 components of flow. I talk about 5 secrets and I weave them through, but I think it's in that same chapter that I write about the paradox of control, which is
Mhm.
one of the kind of trickier flow components to understand, but I think relates to sex in a really profound way. Because what I hear from so many people is that they struggle, women in particular, struggle to surrender
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
experience. They feel too inhibited, too controlled. And, this can cause problems, not just with experiencing pleasure and getting out of your head, but also problems reaching an orgasm or climax. And so, this flow component, I think a lot of people hear, okay, I can't surrender because I'm too controlled. Well, the
Mm.
paradox of control, when it's written about in flow state, research is that you cannot surrender unless you are also in control.
Yes.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
I use a snow skiing analogy to kind of illustrate that point. I like to snow ski, but and when I'm on a blue, I can surrender to the slope. I mean, it is just me and the sound of my skis cutting through the snow, and I am in a total flow state. If I push myself to get onto a black, I am way too controlled. I am like
Mhm.
pizza wedging my scared butt down the mountain, and there is no surrender to be had because I am too far in control, or sometimes too out of control if I,
Yeah.
decide to just go for it, and
Mhm.
Mhm.
and can't surrender there either. So that's what I want a lot of people to remember, and that all kind of funnels down to having a secure relationship attachment. You've got to
Yes.
have that as a foundation in order to let go and enjoy the ride.
Yeah. It's interesting. It just occurred to me as you were saying that 4% idea might apply there too.
Oh, it totally does.
Yeah.
It's a
It's like
great
it's the same
analogy for
idea.
both.
Yeah. It's like you need to be, the exciting part will be that 4% where you have to surrender because you're
Right.
not totally in control, but it's only 4%. So you're
Right. Right.
safe enough. Yeah. You got to be
It's
safe enough
safe
to do it.
enough.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's
Yep.
really neat. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how can people get a hold of your book and get a hold of you and tell us about that?
Thank you. So the book is available everywhere books are sold. It's currently in its hardback and audiobook edition. The paperback will be released later this year. But I also have tons of, if you're kind of struggling to get behind I think it's like the $24 hardback copy of the book, I have hundreds of dollars worth of free online material on my website with qualified purchases. So you can go to emilyjamea.com, click the Anatomy of Desire tab, and it'll walk you through everything you need to do to claim those. You get full access to my workshop. You get things like the intimacy discussion deck, the 30-day intimacy challenge. Like there's tons of goodies there. So it's definitely, you get a lot of bang for your buck. And then I'm on all the social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamea. And as you mentioned, I have the Love and Libido podcast. So you can check me out there too.
Okay, great. So for our listeners, Jamea is spelled Jamea.
And we'll put those links in the show notes as well, of course.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank
Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure chatting with you both.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that interview with Emily. I told you it was jam-packed full of great ideas.
It certainly was. So, yeah, get a hold of her book. Also, get a hold of our books.
Right.
And
A lot of good books out there. So whatever problems that you're having that you need help with solving, I'm sure you can find the answers in some of our books.
Absolutely. And
if you have questions that you would like us to bring up on our podcast, or topics that you would like us to discuss, or if you yourself would even like to be a guest on our podcast, you can go to our website. That's ctin7.com. Couples Therapy, that's what the CT stands for, in7.com.
ctin7.com. You can let us know, as you said, what you might want us to talk about. You can sign up for a time to be a guest, a recording a guest on our podcast, and we'll ask you what you want to talk about. And, as I keep saying, I'll bet if you think you'd be a good guest, I'll bet you would be.
I'll bet you would be.
So feel free to do that. Also, tell everybody about our podcast.
Yeah,
let
follow us. Subscribe to your newsletter.
Oh yeah, my newsletter is
a new platform, right?
I've recently moved it over to Substack, which seems to be it's a great place to have my kind of newsletter, as it turns out. So I will be you'll sign up for that. You can do that from either of our podcast website will work just fine. And so until next time,
remember, be kind,
don't panic,
and have faith.